Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, America's first place city. And today we're talking further about the early American period, which we began with our last episode, talking about the arrival of Governor Andrew Jackson and how he established city, county, and territorial legislatures, and also put in place some of the other activities of the community. Now, we must look also a little bit at what Pensacola itself was like. First, we had an ongoing geography here, which is much like it is today. St. Michael's Cemetery, or at least the continuing part of it, was right in place as it is today. And there was a tavern downtown. We didn't have a real hotel, but Garnier's Tavern was the one well-established place. A government house, which had been built by the Spanish way back in 1752 and had been enlarged several times. It was in place close to the waterfront. And this is where both the city and the county governments had their headquarters. The waterfront itself was not terribly different than it is today. Of course, the what we would call Main Street was right at the edge of the bay. There was one wharf extending out into the water for the calling of vessels. Now, one of the major economic elements which had been here for some time was, of course, what we then called Forbes and Company. This was the original Panton and Leslie trading post, and of course Panton and Leslie were long gone, but the Forbes brothers, who were nephews of William Panton, and again their relatives, the Innerarities, they had come, taken over the business, and here in 1821 they were still actively trading with the Indian tribes, although this would come to an end fairly soon. Now, as we begin the story of 1821, one of the major elements that appeared for Andrew Jackson and others was the problem of land claims, because just before the turnover, the change of flags, there had been a massive exchange of property. Some people wanted in because they felt Pensacola was going to boom. Others wanted out because they were fearful of what might happen here. And so lots of transactions took place. And finally, late in 1818, the federal government, which did not, of course, have jurisdiction here yet, declared that as of a given date, land transactions were frozen, and that there would be established a series of land commissioners who would sit in judgment as to what was legal and what was not. And so one of the things Mr. Jackson appointed, one of the groups he appointed, was the first group of 3 land commissioners. They took office quickly during his term here, and they very rapidly found out that they were having 3 men was totally inadequate, because there were hundreds and hundreds of claims. And so over the next 30 years, land commissions sat here to sit in judgment of who got what land and for what price. Now, I would mention only one series of those because they had a dramatic effect ultimately on all of North Florida, if not local Pensacola. One major claim came from the Forbes brothers and their trading post, because right close to the end of the Spanish period, they had loaned considerable money to both the Creek Indians and to the Spanish government. Of course, the government in Spain itself was all but bankrupt. This amounted to a lot of money, and so when we approached the transfer of flags, the Forbes wanted to get their money, and so they made agreements with both the Creek Indians and with the Spanish government, and the arrangement was that each one would deed to Forbes and Company 1.2 million acres of ground, most of it fairly close to where Apalachicola is today. So basically, on paper, Forbes and Company had almost 2.5 million acres of land over there. And their case dragged on and on and on, month after month, year after year, and finally was settled, and the federal government sitting in judgment, denied their claim, and so that was almost the end of Forbes and Company. Well, as we started forward, of course, 2 things now began to happen here in Pensacola that are of lasting interest to it. Number 1 was military, and number 2 was religious. We'll talk about the religious side first. Number 1, when Andrew Jackson took over and when Rachel came in and spent her time with Dr. Brosenham and observed how the Sabbath was observed, there was basically one faith here. That was the Roman Catholic Church. They didn't have a church. They did have priests, and they held their services, they tell me, on the 2nd floor of a warehouse down close to the water. That was basically it. And so when the American period began, several of the Protestant denominations felt that they should send missionaries in here very quickly to try and established churches of their faith. And so the first man to arrive, and he arrived here late in 1821, was named Alexander Talley. And Talley was sent out by the Carolina Conference of the Methodist Church. Mr. Talley was assigned with the idea of trying to establish mission churches in Pensacola and in Mobile. He came, he worked diligently for a year, and he failed to gain a single advocate for his church. He left, was reassigned, and an interesting sideline, Mr. Talley was assigned to the Cherokee Indians in the Carolinas. And that, of course, was almost at the time when the Cherokees' Trail of Tears began. And so Mr. Talley accompanied them as a priest or a missionary all the way in their journey, all the way out to the Oklahoma Territory. That was basically the last we would see of him. Now, the Methodists sent successive missionaries. About every 18 months, a new one would come, and basically they had precious little success as well. But the third one, Reverend Hardy, did raise enough money to build a little chapel, a little wooden building at the corner of Tarragona and Intendencia Street, and they began to hold services for whoever might show up. And that little chapel would have a part of our story and religion for some time to come. In 1828, the Presbyterians sent a missionary out of the Carolinas. His name was David Robinson Preston. Mr. Preston arrived, and by this time, of course, a number of new people were coming into the Escambia County area, and some of them happened to be Presbyterians, but most of them were strung up the Escambia River. And we're very fortunate that Mr. Preston, Reverend Preston, kept a diary, and it has survived. And it tells us about what he saw and people he met. And when he finally finished, of course, his report back to his conference was, yes, there are members of our denomination here, but they're so badly scattered that I don't think the time is right yet for us to establish a church. So he left, but he did leave us a very interesting story. Late in 1828, another man arrived. He was this time an Episcopalian, again sent out by the Episcopal Conference in the Carolinas. This man was named Ralph Williston. And Williston took a different pose. By 1828, we had a newspaper here, the Gazette. And so Mr. Williston put a little ad in the paper saying, I invite all those who are practicing Protestant Christians to join me for a meeting in the government house on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock to talk about establishing a church. Well, he had no idea who might show up, but at that meeting there were 12 Episcopalians, 10 Methodists, 2 Baptists, and 2 Presbyterians. And they sat down, and amazingly, they got along well. And they agreed that they would work together and establish a common church. And from that point on, they did all of the things that you would consider. They began to raise money. Someone deeded them a free lot on what became Church Street. This is right up, of course, opposite the what we call Seville Square. And they raised money here and there and elsewhere. At that point in time, they were very fortunate in that the U.S. Constitution, that great warship of the Revolutionary period, the War of 1812 period, had arrived here for a visit. And the commandant here then went from man to man on the crew, and he raised over $300 from them, which was rather remarkable. And then they got a large gift, $500 from Christ Church of Philadelphia. Well, the work proceeded, and late in 1832, the church was completed. And this, of course, is how we established what we today call Old Christ Church. It was given that name because, of course, of the gift from the church in Philadelphia. And now these 4 denominations came together. They agreed that since there were more Episcopalians to start, they would adopt that form of worship. And so a succession of ministers came. They had very bad luck because over the next 10 to 15 years, 3 of the Episcopal ministers died, 2 of them of fever and another one of other diseases. And all 3 of those men were interred below the chancel in that church. And for years there was a sort of a rumor around that had happened. No one was quite sure. And some 20 years ago, with the help of good citizen Crawford Rainwater, Dr. Judy Benz from the university and her team went under the church and did an archaeological dig. And absolutely, there were the 3 skeletons there. So all were very carefully and very tenderly reinterred. And that's where they are today. So the Episcopal Church is well funded under the chancel of Old Christ Church. Now, Again, getting just a little ahead of our story, these four denominations remained together in that church for 13 years. But by the time we reached 1845, the town was changing. There were more people arriving of each of the denominations. And in 1845, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists all broke away and formed their own churches and built their own chapels downtown. The Episcopal Church, of course, remained inside of Old Christ Church, which was where it was. And that, of course, remained their church until 1903. Now, the second part of our story, of course, was, as I said a minute ago, was military. And we have to take a look at international affairs at this point to understand what happened next. By the time Florida became part of the United States, the Spanish control of Latin America was literally crumbling. Spain itself had gone through a terrible time during the Napoleonic Wars. The people in the Latin American countries had viewed what had happened here in the Americas, and then, of course, they had seen the French Revolution, how that had resulted in a great change. So revolutions were breaking out all over Latin America, and in Washington, President Monroe and his cabinet were very, very, very concerned because they feared that as the Spanish strength subsided, the British or the French or both might try to move into a power vacuum in Latin America, and that was the last thing in the world the young United States wanted. So they decided to make a statement. And this statement, of course, came out as what we all know from our history books was the Monroe Doctrine, saying that other powers are not welcome in this hemisphere. But to make such a statement was just idle words unless you had something to back it up. And so the Congress elected to do two things. First of all, they were going to establish a South Atlantic naval fleet of some size. And of course, no sense in having a fleet if you don't have a place to care for it. So they decided, secondly, we are going to create a Navy Yard where that fleet would be not necessarily based, but where it would go for maintenance or repair. And so the thing that happened late in 1823 was that the Navy Department appointed a three-man team. These men were all Commodores. One was named Warrington, the second was Biddle, and the third was Bainbridge. And these three men had a mission. They were to go to every sizable bay and inlet along the Gulf of Mexico and decide where should we put our Navy Yard. They went from here to there, and of course they visited Pensacola. By now there was enough established interest here and government and certain leadership that those three men were wined and dined in grand style. And when it was all finished, they chose Pensacola as the place where the Navy Yard was to be constructed. And within a matter of months, Lewis Warrington, Commodore Warrington, was named the first commanding officer of the Navy Yard, and he returned here to begin his work. Now, Mr. Warrington had a difficult assignment. If you will, visualize that the site of the yard, which was the site had been chosen, was where the Naval Air Station is today. And that's better than 10 miles walk from downtown Pensacola. So there was no practical way that people could live in Pensacola and work at the Navy Yard. So one of the first things he began to do, in addition to basically laying out the yard, was to provide the beginnings of a village where such people would be allowed would live. And the second thing, of course, he had to do was make sure that there was a supply of timber. We had to have solid oak forest for repairing the vessels themselves, and then, of course, we had pine for masts and spars. And so, working with Judge Breckinridge, Lewis Warrington made the rounds and selected two 10,000-acre sites, one of oak, one of pine, and made the purchases and set them up as the raw materials reserve for the Navy Yard. Next, he had to have manpower, because he made a quick survey of Pensacola itself, and there were practically no shipwrights, millwrights, all of the basic skills that he needed. And so he did what a good man today would do. He employed what we today might call a headhunter. A man's name was Nathan Keep, and Keep went from seaport to seaport, Navy Yard Navy Yard after Navy Yard up on the East Coast, lined up the men that Warrington needed, and these men and their families now began to move south and to build their own homes in this Warrington village, which Mr. Warrington had laid out. And so by 1825-26, the Navy Yard itself is taking form. People are coming here to do the work, and people in Pensacola are very excited because it looks like prosperity is right around the corner. And that was step one for the military.